After recently hitting 1.0, odds are if you've clicked this video, you have a decent idea of what Vampire Survivors is. It's been an indie sensation that has taken the scene by storm. To put it bluntly, Vampire Survivors is a good game. A very good game. And before I start to really delve into the main meat of this video, I fully recommend playing the game. It's only like $5 US, and even if you follow that weird dollar to hour ratio in terms of how you evaluate a game, you'll end up with far more than what you put in. With that said, let's go into some preliminary info regarding roguelites, because I believe the evolution of the genre is something important as to what makes Vampire Survivors work. Let's start with where most people attribute the birth of the modern roguelite, and talk about The Binding of Isaac. The Binding of Isaac was pretty much the first big development in the current era of roguelites, featuring many of the factors that I think really define the genre for many. Isaac was a top-down twin-stick shooter in which you navigate through procedurally generated levels and find randomly placed items. When you die, you're sent right back to the start and lose everything. The main driving idea is that every playthrough of The Binding of Isaac is meant to be different from the other. You'll pretty much never find the same items in the same order, and the end of every run is going to look like a different kind of clusterfuck from the last. It dominated the indie scene and was just an absolute smash hit, leading to a sequel, remake, port, whatever you'd call it, in The Binding of Isaac Rebirth. It also, as you can expect, led to a lot of games that were inspired by it. Games like Wasteland Kings / Nuclear Throne or Enter the Gungeon were some of the first adopters that really made a splash in the scene, where they took the foundation that The Binding of Isaac established and built upon it to create their own experience. Alongside these developments, another important game to mention is Rogue Legacy. Specifically, I'd like to make a note of how Rogue Legacy took a new focus to the idea of meta progression within roguelites. To better explain what I mean by meta progression, I'm talking about the kinds of upgrades and changes that permanently alter your save file and change every run you will play afterwards. This change was a very fundamental shakeup compared to something like The Binding of Isaac, because these tend to lead to runs becoming a little more homogenized between themselves. This isn't an overt negative for the game, however, it's a very notable difference in how you approach the game. This creates the idea that you're playing more of an interwoven story between runs with an overarching goal, as opposed to a series of separate runs that are relatively self-contained. Rogue Legacy was a big innovator in this concept, and it led to many other games taking notes from it. Games like Dead Cells, or probably the most notable, Hades. Odds are if you've played indie games at all, you've heard of Hades. It was developed by renowned studio Supergiant, and it really has that feeling of being a roguelite built around your grand journey as opposed to each individual run, which pays off. Hades is an incredible game, and was nominated for Game of the Year that year. There's very little I can say about Hades that's negative. In a lot of ways, I think Hades marked a natural climax for this style of roguelite for me, because of how well it fused the repetitive but changing nature of a roguelite with a real sense of grand progression. Though, for me, this now led to a time where I was starting to wane on roguelites as a genre. As Hades was such a massive success, it felt like the genre was shifting more and more into this idea of a focus on meta progression, and less within the runs itself. The Binding of Isaac was still doing its thing as an expansion had actually released within this time frame, but generally it felt to me, as someone who was pretty invested in the genre as a whole, there were less and less games releasing like it. This was until Vampire Survivors released. Vampire Survivors, to talk about it more mechanically, is a very simple game. All you actually do as the player is walk around, pick things up, choose your upgrades, and kinda dodge enemies. Where the complexity comes in, though, is it's focused extremely on the idea of player progression and upgrades through a run. This is because, as a player, just raw mechanical skill doesn't actually take you very far. You live and die based purely on your upgrades, and that makes the mere act of progressing feel engaging. It's an interesting prospect because generally this is the kind of thing that can actually really kill a roguelike. If you rely too much on upgrades and end up with shitty ones, that feels bad. Vampire Survivors doesn't suffer from this problem because of two main factors. The first being that you get a lot of upgrades very fast. You're constantly powering up and picking up new weapons, then boosting them through your run. The other being that there aren't really any bad upgrades to take. There's some that I personally don't enjoy, but they aren't weak. It's kinda just a preference thing. This culminates in Vampire Survivors, to me, being more of a strategy game than anything. You are constantly presented with DPS checks that you have to pass. The thought you are putting into this is not into your gameplay, but in your decision making. Certain weapons naturally synergize together and will make things smoother. Furthermore, every weapon features an evolution that can be acquired by having that weapon alongside a specific passive. These evolutions are very powerful upgrades that are going to generally be your primary source of power by the end of a run. The interesting part about evolutions comes from the limitations placed upon what you can acquire during a run. Generally in Vampire Survivors, you can only have 6 unique weapons and 6 unique passives. Each of them can be further empowered by picking up the same item again. Now, what makes all the evolutions interesting to me is that while, yes, you could have all 6 of your weapons have the equal 6 passives to make them evolve, but that might actually not feel that good for your run. So you may end up in a situation where you intentionally pass up on an evolution so you can get stats that are more relevant to you. Or you'll want to take up specific weapons that are better for your character, but evolve with passives that are relatively useless. And I really mean it when I say that you have to put thought into your build. Eventually what you face is far beyond overwhelming. I've intentionally yet to show what the endgame of a run will look like, so here's what you can expect from the last few minutes of one. To summarize, the biggest element as to why I think Vampire Survivors is a fantastic game is the entire concept of it being a roguelite built around the strategy of progression. It takes the raw concept of progression in a roguelite, strips away almost everything else, and has you play as a vessel for progress. You end up with a game that has a feel of a more classic roguelite in the raw variety of runs, while also having modern design principles. Something else is how Vampire Survivors actually does feature a similar permanent upgrade structure that lasts between runs like Rogue Legacy or Hades. However, due to the game being so focused and designed on each run being the borderline personification of progressing, it still feels consistently fresh and fun while not being samey like some of the other games can fall into. The game also serves as an amazing baseline. It actually wasn't the first game to experiment with this idea. Games like Snake RX predate it with similar ideas, and Magic Survival is a very direct inspiration for it. But much like how Isaac may have not been the first game of its kind, it still was the fundamental bedrock for the modern genre. Similarly, Vampire Survivors is the prime inspiration for what I'm about to talk about, which is where I will now delve into it being more than just a game. Vampire Survivors is the beginning of a new subgenre, the Garlic-like. 20 Minutes Till Dawn, Rogue Ganesha, Her Name Was Fire, Bone Razor's Minions, Brotato, Hollow Cure, Just King, Soulstone Survivors, and those are just a few of the games that I have personally played, but the list goes on and on. There are a shitload of games that are already very directly inspired by Vampire Survivors, and it rules so hard. What Vampire Survivors did in providing such an especially solid baseline was also provide extremes. I consider Vampire Survivors to be a game of extremes. It is as far as you can go in the direction of simplicity, while also arguably being the upper limit for how far you can escalate the concept. Let me remind you what the end of a run looks like. Having these upper limits established means that further developers can either try to somehow find ways to one-up Vampire Survivors in these regards, or choose to work within the scale and find their own niche to appeal to someone. Immediately you can find these types of iterations and developments just within the games I've listed. Take Brotato, which is one that I've put a notable amount of time into. The first key difference is that it's segmented into waves of combat as opposed to just being a straight line, where there aren't any breaks. The other notable difference is that there is a currency to manage as opposed to just making your number go up like in Vampire Survivors. You have a shopping phase where you spend your money, but there are also elements that play with it, so maybe you end up wanting to save cash so you could build interest, things like that. There's a lot more strategy involved in how you obtain your upgrades in Brotato, because you have a resource that ends up having a lot of layers to it to consider. I'm not going to sit here and list every single difference, but just with that alone, you can start to get a picture of how developers can implement a lot of wrinkles into the formula and create a game that is very clearly based upon Vampire Survivors, but feel extremely different in practice. To a spectator, these games may seem more or less the same. I mean, all you do is walk around, have your weapons automatically attack enemies. Yet while playing, you'll end up having extremely different feelings and ideas to work through. Another title that's noteworthy in the lineup for being different is 20 Minutes Till Dawn. This one has the biggest fundamental change in that you manually aim and fire your weapon, making it more like a twin-stick shooter. However, it still follows the Garlic-like formula in just requiring you to survive for a certain amount of time and having enemies that don't do anything too complicated, while also showering you in upgrades of growing intensity. This adds a little bit of mechanical still to it because aiming and positioning start to matter a lot more. And these are just two examples of games that stick pretty close to the standard formula, but the room for unique ideas is already blown wide open. And I could keep going on for a long time, going through all these games and what makes them feel different while maintaining the structure. But I'm not going to do that for the sake of time. Surely by now you, the viewer, have a pretty solid idea of what I mean when describing the versatility the garlic-like genre offers. And it's worth mentioning this is only the first year. Hell, it hasn't even been a full year of iteration and improvement. Who knows what further creatives will find and add to the genre with their own unique twists. The potential is truly limitless, and I think circling back, we can really thank Vampire Survivors for this. One last important thing that I'd like to touch upon is that I already know people will complain about bloat. They will say that too many garlic-likes are being released and it will kill the genre with saturation, claiming people will be sick of them. I contest this with the idea that I find it for the most part inspiring more than anything. The fact that so many people are finding themselves motivated into creating their own garlic-like is something to nurture as opposed to condemn. This could serve as many people's first attempt at getting their foot in the door and really get their own product out there. Even if it's something so iterative on another game, it is something that they can say they created and released and use the experience productively in their future endeavors. Sure, there are bound to be examples of people cashing in on a trend and creating very half-assed games just to make some money off of it. However, whatever negatives are involved with that, I believe are heavily outweighed by the positives that come with everything else I've described. This new generation and push within the indie roguelite scene is why Vampire Survivors is more than just a game. It's a genre, a trailblazer for us all to witness a new era, a way for everyone to peek into the rawest elements of a roguelite. And of course, it is still a video game.